Thank you all speakers for participating in the meeting today. I have a very quick question. You talked about Iran being out of jurisdiction because it's not a member of the International Criminal Court. Can the Bashir scenario ever be applicable to the Islamic Republic's rulers? Could you explain a bit of that? And a very quick question for our wonderful documentary maker, Masoud. We discussed this during the break. Just a point you made in your introduction of the film, that the people who are victims of violence take time before they can actually vocalize what's happened to them. And that's very relevant to what's happening in Iran today. We see a lot of people are actually brave enough to come forward, but then at the same time a lot of people are not. And the question is being asked whether what is actually happening because there are not enough people coming forward. So the point you make, if you made any research into the fact that people take time, victims of violence take time before they can vocalize it, I'd like to hear about that.
Thank you for bringing this issue. It's a phenomenon everywhere. I had this experience in the Chile 2000, which we had a chance to interview some survivor from 1973. It's not easy issue for political prisoners to their story. Okay? Even it was so interesting. I was talking with people who had experiences and they are not able to tell it. So it means it's very important to be kind to them and let them they go through their own process. So it means don't expect what happened in Iran and don't expect from people who were tortured during in prison and quickly come and talk about themselves. Actually, that's why again it's important people from our generation talk about that because we can provide some experiences to them. We went through these things, we are dealing with this issue, and I think it's our responsibility, okay, to talk about that, which is give a room and a space to the come and start to talk.
The answer is no. The answer is that the International Criminal Court has no jurisdiction over Iran. The basis for jurisdiction is either if Iran ratifies the statute, which it has not, and it will not do, most certainly, or if the UN Security Council refers the situation as it did in the case of Darfur, where Sudan was not a signatory, but the Security Council referred the situation. And as I said, the mood at present, the Russian, the Chinese, the British, the French, the Americans, permanent members of the Security Council, is to engage with Iran. It's all about dialogue and engagement. And it's interesting that that is being portrayed as political realism. And that's what exactly we were told in Yugoslavia, that you should be realistic. Sure, Slobodan Milosevic is going to do ethnic cleansing, but we want to bring an end to the war, we need to negotiate with them. And the reason why the tribunal was successful is not because of the loftiness of human rights principles, but because political realists realized that the appeasement of fascists is unrealistic. And I'm hoping that this lesson will be learned in the case of Iran, that a government, half of whose ministers are implicated in murder and torture and rape, is not a reliable government. It's almost like the logic that a child could understand, but not decision makers. I also failed to mention one thing that you can raise further with Babak Emad and the organization, which is an initiative to have a people's tribunal. As part of this process of uncovering the truth and publicizing it, which I think is very important in creating, how would you translate jab, you know, the kind of the point of gravity of the discourse among the Iranian democratic movement. And you know that during the Vietnam War there was the famous Russell Tribunal, Bertrand Russell and Jean-Paul Sartre and a lot of anti-Vietnam activists established a tribunal, which of course is a people's tribunal, it has no official function. But it's a semi-judicial process where the evidence is presented and a panel of eminent judges, make some sort of a ruling. And I hope that this is something that the organizers can develop further as part of the process of, once again, uncovering the facts and educating the Iranian public about what happened in 1988. And more important than anything, something we should do every opportunity that we get, naming and shaming the perpetrators so that everyone knows who they are. And finally, the normal course of events, national courts should prosecute people for these crimes. That's the basis of the International Criminal Court, that only when national courts fail to do so would the International Court. And my hope is that we will one day have an Iran in which the judiciary, instead of being an instrument of repression, will be an instrument of justice. And ideally, the Iranian people themselves would bring these people to justice and claim ownership over their own past, rather than letting some people in The Hague do that for them.
My name is Nazanin. I'm sorry I came
Could we unless I'm in control, it's getting very difficult to run this. And then next, back.
Thank you very much for organizing this fantastic day. It's been very emotional, I think, for all of us here. One of the title of the film was The Tree That Remembers. And you specifically mentioned that we should remember and not forget stories so that we do not make the same mistakes again. I think that perhaps we have forgotten to mention the stories of those who were assassinated, murdered before 1981 because of the revolution. Also, the Cinema Rex incident. Would it be fair to say that it is time for us to also come to terms with our humanity and say that we have all suffered, and that at one point that we reach out to each other through our humanity, and also remember those victims of the revolution?
I appreciate that you raised this issue. Yes, for sure, it's important. It's so important that we can talk about atrocity. We have to find its root, okay? And don't forget, I'm making one documentary, 15 minutes. I cannot address all these issues, and what I was trying to do is materialize our experiences, which was in that time when this film done. It's not actually. It's all 7 minutes animation done almost in 2 years, and by myself. And after that, for years I was working to finish this one, and we had so much difficulty bringing people to talk about this issue. So what I did in this film, and actually, as you know, film does one or two things. Yes, I materialize our experiences and try to make it bring it to kind of turn it to the universal experience.
I'm just going to... Yes, no, just very, very briefly. I think your point goes to the essence of what human rights are all about. I was amicus in the U.S. Supreme Court case against Donald Rumsfeld in front of Yasser Hamdi, a Yemeni national who was in Guantanamo Bay. Many of my friends thought, you're insane, why are you supporting terrorists? And that's the whole point. We do not ask whether we agree with the political or religious beliefs of someone. And I must say that one of the reasons why the 1988 massacre has not been talked about is because the victims were Mujahideen Khalq, Fadar al-Khalq, Tudeh, and many people did not agree with their political ideology, so they swept aside the human rights. And that's a shame for all of us in Iran. And I would say the same thing about the officials of the Shah's government that were executed and tortured after summary trials, and about reformists, and about Kurds and Baluch and Baha'is and Jews and whatever the case may be. And if the Iranians begin to understand that very factor, then they will have taken a large step towards creating a culture of human rights. One small point, you said assassinations. The thing that came to mind were the 260 Iranian dissidents that were killed in Europe. Something which is remarkable that there were only a handful of prosecutions. And this goes back to the complicity of these governments in allowing the Islamic Republic to perpetrate this violence. How did that violence come to an end? You'll know about the Mykonos massacre in Berlin, and the fact that finally the German judiciary, against the wishes of the German Foreign Ministry, prosecuted the individuals. In protest, all European ambassadors, with the exception of Greece, were withdrawn from Tehran. There have been no more assassinations in Europe since the Mykonos judgment. And that is an example of what the Europeans could do if they took seriously their economic leverage and told Iran that we are not going to do business with you if you murder and rape people in your prisons. And in this country, the freezing of the assets of Mojtaba Khomeini, to the extent, I believe, of £1 billion right here in this city, which still remains under a cloud of mystery, is exactly what the European governments need to do to bring this regime to its knees.
We know that the Iranian government has been killing the Iranian people since the beginning. The British, American, and other foreign governments have been aware of that. They have supported Iran in different ways, and the Iranian government, in order to exist, continue to massacre people in different parts of the country. Now, it is only, I think, to us, 30 years have proved that the foreigners will not help the Iranian people to change this government, and that the policies of this government will not change until we change this regime. Therefore, I think it is up to us, to Iranians, to get united, as the Iranians inside Iran appeared at least 4 times in meetings to say that they don't want this regime. And the foreign governments, especially the British government, must understand that we hold them responsible. All the governments that sample help the Iranian regime in massacring Iranian people. And we also know that we will work hard, and we know that one day we can change this regime. And when we change this regime, all the files will be open, and everybody will know that who has worked with this government and which foreign countries have supported this government in doing what it is doing now.
Mr. Doctor, thank you very much for the list you given about the all criminal ayatollahs. My question is here, why you don't name Kadrovi, Mir Hossein Mousavi, and Khatami? Mir Hossein Mousavi was the prime minister during that time we are speaking about, was one of the most powerful man in the Iran. He killed thousands and thousands of people in Iran. I'm from Kurdistan and Mr. Wai from that time. So I just wanted to know why you censor it, or why you don't name those three guys. Is that because he has with the green, let's say, peoples with the green, colors just know what it is. I would like to have the answer for that.
Well, I'm wearing a green tie, but I did not vote for Mr. Mousavi. And if you look at this report, I can even show you the picture of Mr. Mousavi, just so that you're pleased. What I want to say is that we should, here is Mr. Mousavi, there you go. Okay? Now, from a criminal law point of view, as opposed to a political point of view, one cannot say that a massacre happened, you were in the government, therefore you're responsible. It's not as simple as that. I'm not saying that these people are not responsible, but we have to understand how they're responsible. Are they legally responsible? Are they morally responsible? And I think that beyond the question of prosecuting people, we also need to think in terms of a truth commission. Because prosecutions are very narrowly defined. Prosecutions are about the defendant, not about the victims, right? The victims are only relevant if they can be linked back to the defendant. And in South Africa and Argentina, we had truth commissions, which allowed for tens of thousands of victims to come and tell their stories. And we have had examples in Chile, for example, after Pinochet went out of power, one of the first things that Patricio Aylwin did was to apologize on behalf of the government to all the victims of the atrocities under Pinochet. So all I'm trying to say is that justice has many different meanings. And yes, those who were in positions of authority back then, irrespective of whether they're legally responsible or not, will also have to come one day and at least explain, if not apologize. But I also want to say that we need to be careful not to say that anyone that is associated with that regime is forever to be blacklisted, because it's not as simple as that. Every revolution swallows its own children. And what we see throughout history is that the greatest threat to the power of the regime comes from within. What is happening in Iran is no different. So we have to understand that in the intermediate stage at least, it will be exactly those internal divisions that are going to help create a wider democratic space in which a genuinely new leadership and culture can emerge. But we can't, on the one hand, turn a blind eye to the fact that some of those who are now reformists were also implicated, but we also have to accommodate this transitional reality at the same time.
Well, we take two more questions, one at the front and one right at the back. You'll be waving in the floor.
I would like to thank you, the Association of Iranian Political Prisoners. When I came to Sweden many years ago, I was young. And we were the first generation victims of all those atrocities, which you're actually remembering today. But, well, the revolution is almost achieved, but we are talking about grandsons at the moment. I was wondering how long it's going to take. 30 years, all those countries have changed. And Romania, after Ceausescu, got just going easy now. Everybody changing them back to their countries. But our country is still in pain and suffering. The question is here to, first of all, I wanted to thank you for that great speech that each one of you actually presented. It was beautiful in your documentary as well. Welcome to everybody. But the question is, what is happening to the fundamentalism of freedom in this country? That you were mentioning that people like Karl Marx came to this country, Montesquieu came to this country. What is the responsibility of the British public? And what has happened after 9/11? How is it that everyone is getting away with it? Iran is getting away with it. The United Kingdom is getting away with the occupation of Iraq. Everyone is getting away with it. What is about the conscience? And I was, after the raising question of the ban, and what our responsibility as a resident or citizen of the United Kingdom is, I wanted to ask and thank you for your effort, both Nazanin and Dr. as well. Well done. But can we actually put a benchmark today that we're going to stop again, and how are we going to do it? Because you told us about leaving Security Council or Parliament or whatever in Geneva. What was the result? Could you tell us how it's going to happen? Thank you.
So, as I understood, the question was about Iraq and
I was talking about the fundamental freedom in this country. It's happening on a day-to-day, because we said that you're no longer interested because it's not illegal. And what's happened after 9/11?
well, I mean, and in terms of, let me focus on freedom of speech. In terms of that, like I said, that very fundamental right, a number of things conspired around 9/11, and in fact, some of them had already been developed previously to 9/11. It was much easier for the government to get backing for these kinds of measures in the wake of the kind of public hysteria about terrorism. Just as the McCarthy regime took hold of America in the 1950s because of a moral panic about communism. So various pieces of very tough anti-terror legislation, some of which were actually passed in 2000, which, for instance, make the possession of materials which might be useful to a terrorist a criminal offence punishable by up to 10 years in prison. Now, those materials can include books, they can include things which are easily downloaded from the internet, and we saw this in the case of a 19-year-old girl called Samina Malik, who happens to work in W.H. Smith's at Heathrow, and wrote some very bad poetry in which she fantasised about killing infidels, and she called herself a lyrical terrorist, and circulated these poems on the internet, and she was subject to a court case under Section 58 of the Terrorism Act for possessing not just the poems, but also various training manuals and so on that she had downloaded in her bedroom in West London. She seemed to pose no threat to the fabric of society, and her crime, to the extent it was a crime, was a thought crime, that she had very, very nasty thoughts about what she might like to do to some of us. Now, many of us have pretty nasty thoughts from time to time. So that's what worries me, is that idea that the business of the state, which once stopped quite far away from our front door, is now poking around in our bedrooms. It's now poking around in our computers and our private musings. And partly we are to blame for this, for sharing those private thoughts with the world through our blogs and email correspondences and our social networking sites, in the rather naive belief that these media are somehow democratic. We're actually giving vast amounts of data to corporations and to states with no interest in our views on our favourite music, but a lot of interest in what we might be thinking about the state and its implications. So I don't want to say much more about Britain. It's not the topic of today's event, but I'm very conscious that whilst, and I have to keep this in proportion, the kinds of atrocities taking place in Iran are not taking place in Britain. There is a spectrum, and we are, in this country, we're very close to one end of that spectrum. Iran right now is quite close to the other end of the spectrum. Burma and other places are slightly further down the line. But I do think there is a spectrum, and I think it's worth fighting for those liberties that we have. And as I said, not letting them be chipped away inch by inch by inch, because suddenly you've lost a mile and you're down the other end of the spectrum.
I believe you were asking what is the result of some of the activities that we've been doing. As a human rights activist, our work isn't always immediately apparent. There's an expression in Farsi we say, which means drop by drop we create an ocean of change. And I was at, as I said, the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva a few days ago. I don't know what's going to be the result of it immediately. I was happy, though, that the Islamic Republic of Iran felt the need to reply after I spoke to say that my claims were unsubstantiated. So, little by little we can make the Islamic Republic budge. And it's not that I also just had that one speech in that room and that's it. We meet with individual missions, we meet with ambassadors from different countries, and we give them recommendations because they really want to know what we want from them. And if you are following, Iran's Universal Periodic Review is coming up at the UN. Every 4 years, countries are reviewed, and Iran's is coming up in February. And countries would like human rights activists and others to send their individual missions a one-pager which you specify a question you would like them to ask the Islamic Republic of Iran, or specific detailed issues you would like to have brought up. So this is something that our group will definitely follow up with these missions. And just as an aside, as I said earlier, we each have our responsibility. So let's just say the protests that are coming up outside of the UN on the 23rd and 24th, outside the UN in New York, when Ahmadinejad job's going to speak at the UN General Assembly. Well, those protests, you might say, well, what really is that going to do? I mean, it's not going to stop anything. But let's just say an individual in Iran sees that protest and sees, wow, the international community is behind us, they haven't forgotten us. Maybe that will encourage them the next time around to go out on the street and not to lose hope. And so, again, it's really hard to specify what is taking place, but the movement is happening, and each individual adds to that.
One final question. You've been waving it back for a very long time.
Thank you very much for this wonderful seminar to bring the crime of Islamic Republic to the attention of us Iranian and the West and East that we all knew. But we knew that Islamic Republic from the beginning, when they started the execution from the first week after the revolution. But what I'm saying, in Iran there are 70 million people. 65 million are against the Islamic Republic, and the 5 million are the mercenaries of Islamic Republic. But do you not think these 65 million in Iran, and also a few million outside Iran, the responsibility lies on our shoulder to, instead of struggling for gripping, to getting hold of the power, share the power, under the umbrella of democracy, get together and share the power rather than get hold on the power. That is the only way we can have a free Iran under the umbrella of democracy. Iran belongs to 70 million and we all share that country. Thank you.
I don't think there's a problem with the 65 million willing to share the power. It's the 5 million. And you're exactly right. Iran has religious people, it has secular people, it has Orthodox Shia and reformists, and Iran is all of those things. And we need to understand that a democratic Iran should accommodate all of those. And I think that the importance is that human rights is not about the acquisition of power. That's the difference between a human rights activist and a politician. Human rights is about speaking truth to power. And it's a never-ending process. Even if tomorrow there is a secular democratic republic in Iran, we will still need institutions that will speak truth to power if we're not going to lapse back into our authoritarian ways. And frankly speaking, the only difference between the leaders of, let's say, a Western democracy and leaders in Iran is that the leaders in a Western democracy can get away with less. It's not necessarily that there's going to be some intrinsic moral superiority. It's a question of what is the culture within which power is exercised. And in Iran, not just under the Islamic Republic, but under the monarchies and far beyond that, the culture was one of power is a license to abuse, as opposed to a responsibility to the people. And getting back to what Nazanin was saying and what the gentleman was saying, it's easy to discount the importance of discourse, what we're talking about today. There's a famous Canadian Supreme Court case about hate speech, which says that the Holocaust did not begin in the gas chambers of Nazi Germany, it began with words. And the creation of a free and democratic Iran, in which there's a culture of human rights, also has to begin with words, with the discourse that we have. We should make no mistake about it. It's the struggle of those who are in Iran, those who are willing to pay with their lives, that is ultimately going to change the reality. But I think that the diaspora, not just Iranians, but also civil society internationally, which is why I'm so grateful to Sir Henry and the many other dear friends who have no connection with Iran other than their belief in human rights, who are standing with us. We should look at the example of South Africa. How important international public opinion was in isolating South Africa and undermining it. The hard work and the heavy lifting was done by the people that struggled in South Africa, that were willing to be political prisoners and be abused. But I think that we also have a share to play. And the fact that the regime is so desperately trying to gain legitimacy now. I think one of the first things that Manu Motaki, the foreign minister, did after the crushing of the protest was to offer a new package of proposals to the West. One of the first things that he did. The same regime that for 30 years chanted death to America now wants more than anything to be recognized by Washington so that it can gain the legitimacy that it needs to come back and decisively crush the opposition, something that is afraid to do now. And I think that it's our responsibility to make our voice heard and to make sure that the politics of foreign governments are to the interest of the Iranian people. I'm just going to say one final thing about the far right and the far left in the West. They are not that far apart because both of them have an essentialized image of the Islamic world and of Iran in particular. The right wing thinks the Islamic world is inherently backwards and incapable of democracy, so we need to invade and rebuild the society in our image. The far left believes that we are so politically correct and tolerant that we can even shake hands with President Ahmadinejad and give him airtime on Channel 4. Aren't we wonderful and tolerant? Never mind at whose expense it is. Both of them see Iranian society and other foreign societies as a fossil in a museum, as opposed to a dynamic, ever-changing reality. And the powerful thing about what happened 2-3 months ago is the rebuke to that view, both on the right and left wings of the spectrum, that somehow all Iranians are followers of President Ahmadinejad, that people in the Islamic world and Iran are not capable of democracy. And what I find particularly offensive among so-called progressive elements is the suggestion that this is just a bunch of bourgeois from northern Tehran who are pouring out into the streets. Whereas today, it's the Basij that are the bourgeois, because they're getting paid $2,000 a month to club and rape people.
We've all been very patient today. I'm sorry for all the problems at the start, and we've run over a bit. Thank you all very much for staying. I've been asked to say one or two words in conclusion before we have a beautiful singer to speed us on our way to drinks next door. I remember St. Paul's Cathedral being packed about 4 years ago with British human rights lawyers and those of us who were judges who were concerned about human rights overseas. And Desmond Tutu was speaking. And he said, "You have no idea what difference it made to us in South Africa fighting the evil of apartheid, when we realized how much support we had from the likes of you. Let's all give each other a clap." And he had a very big smile, and we all clapped, although I'm sure we were unworthy of what he said. So far as Iran today is concerned, you've had the speakers talk about the need for change among the people of Iran. I'm old enough to have watched that kind of change happening in totalitarian regimes all over the world. The countries behind the Iron Curtain, Chile, Yugoslavia, South Africa, to just name a few. Currently, I'm president of a foundation which has strong links with lawyers and judges in Central and Eastern Europe. And I never dreamt when I became an English judge in 1988 that I would be spending my time 21 years later talking to lawyers and judges in Ukraine about how to impress human rights norms into that country which has been under overseas domination for so long. So the challenge tonight is twofold. One, what can we do in this country to help those in Iran whose destiny lies very much in what they do and say, and what they're brave enough to do and say. We can all remember the people of Central Europe taking to the streets in their tens of thousands just before the Iron Wall came down. But secondly, what can we do for those who are victims and the families of the victims who were massacred in those dreadful events 21 years ago? Those are people, brave people, who were put to death for having the courage to stand up for what they was right. And as chairman of Prison for Conscience, I'm very conscious of what it means for the families. I'm a patron of another regime, which is going to have an event in London, not very far from here, 6 weeks' time, which I've invited Lord Bingham, who retired as senior law lord last year, to come and chair, where one of the widows of the disappeared in Mexico in the 1970s is coming to talk to us, and I've had chat about a courageous fight to have her husband's case brought in front of the Inter-American Human Rights Commission. There's work to do. The professor talked about the idea of having a commission and tribunal on the lines of the Russell Tribunal 30 years ago. Whether it goes that way, whichever ways it goes, there is a challenge which will be posed to us tonight in London for those people who were massacred, executed without trial in Iran should not be forgotten. And there should be some way of doing justice on their behalf, which was not done to them when they were put to death. But that's all I want to say tonight, except to announce, and we are really sorry to have left my name off the program. We're going to close with Gisru Shakiri, a woman